Fine. Gotta get the stream.
Yes.
All right, that's doing its thing. And let's go ahead and get the text. There we are. As usual, we'll give it just a second before we get started, just to make sure that people have time to log in. But not too much time, because we don't want to encourage people to show up late. Plus, I have a meeting at 7, so we have a hard stop. All right, well, it looks like the YouTube stream is working. Looks like we've got the usual suspects logged into the Zoom. So let's go ahead and get going. Good evening to everyone. And tonight we are going to be looking at the movements. The movements is the term that we use in Judaism for the different sects, denominations, schools of thought. There are many different ways to describe the different divisions within the Jewish people along philosophical and ideological lines. And we are going to look at the primary way that the different divisions have grouped themselves over the last 200 years. This is a natural carry-on from our conversation last week, because last week when we talked about Hanukkah, one of the big problems was the division that was among the people that were fighting for Hellenism or non-Hellenism. And yes, as Joseph points out in chat, streams is another word that sometimes get used to describe the different groups. Now, it's important to understand that Judaism has never been monolithic. There has never been some slavish unanimity, cloning of all Jewish people. There has always been different types of distinctions. However, there are some types that have been very bad for us, and some types that have been neutral or even positive for us. So among the bad types of diversity, well, there were those that were trying to follow Torah and God, and those who wanted to worship idols. There were those who wanted to rebel against Moses' leadership, Korach being the most famous, and those who wanted to follow Moses. There were the group known as the Sadducees, the Sicarii, the Essenes during the last half of the Second Temple period. And later on, there was a group called Karaites, which rejected the entire idea of a traditional Judaism whole cloth. All of these types of divisions were set with the idea of pulling us apart, of making distinctions that would create irreparable and insurmountable rifts within the Jewish people. And as such, that type of divisiveness has been very problematic. However, you'll notice that those divisions are mostly from the ancient world. And there's a reason for that, which we will discuss. But the neutral or more positive types of diversity and nonconformity in Judaism has been there since the beginning. After all, last week and this week, we continue to read about the different sons of Jacob and the fact that we had different tribes that each would have their own flavor and character was considered a positive thing. The fact that there were Jews who lived in cities and others who lived in the rural area also gave a different perspective depending upon where they lived and different information and informed the decisions. The Kohanim, the Leviim, and the others also had different roles, different responsibilities, but as part of a collective whole. And of course, the most famous and persistent divisions, the Ashkenazic or European division, the Sephardic or those of Spanish origin, the Mizrahi, those of Middle Eastern origin, the Yemenites and the Ethiopians and other cultural groups of Jews persist to this day. And those divisions are not considered to be divisive, but instead are either neutral decorative elements, providing unique music and language and culture and styles of clothing and styles of food, or even a robust positive diversity, much the same way that an animal species requires a certain breadth of population in order to ensure the overall health of the species. You don't want all of your animals to be the same. Very famous modern example being the cheetah, which has very little genetic diversity and is suffering for it, or perhaps closer to many people's homes, so-called purebred animals, dogs or cats, that have developed severe health defects because of the lack of diversity. Judaism respects and has been kept healthy by a lot of different forms of diversity over our thousands of years of life. So when we're talking about the movements, the different streams of Judaism, we must be talking about something else than just the fact that there are different flavors on the table. Now, to understand where these streams came from, where the movements came from, we have to do a little history. We're going to do a lot more history eventually, but this hopefully will get you at least a bit up to speed on where we are in the modern world. So I want you to roll back your memory a little bit. Imagine you were living in, let's say the 1500s. And in the 1500s, you're living in, let's say Berlin. Or maybe you're living in parts of what would eventually be Poland, Ukraine. It kept shifting back and forth depending upon the decade. Or maybe you're living in Baghdad. Or maybe you're living in Fez in Morocco. Many different places around the world where there are Jewish communities. If you were to do a survey of your community, you would find that in all of these communities, there were the usual cast of characters. You had some old, you had some young, you had some that were very knowledgeable and scholarly, some that were not so very knowledgeable or scholarly. You had some that were wealthy and some that were poor, some that ruled for themselves or for others very strictly, or for themselves or others very leniently. Some that were very pious, taking to heart all of the teachings of our tradition, and some that were very impudent, trying to rebel against Judaism as a way of life. Some that were lawful, both in Torah as well as more secular law from the surrounding culture, and some that were criminal with regards to either of that. Some that were traditionalist, meaning they were always keeping to whatever they had received with no creativity or additional ideas, and others that would have been creative and looking for new ways to express themselves with new poetry, new song, new melodies, new flavors, new clothing, etc., etc. Prior to the Enlightenment, you would have found all of these people in the same community, and they would have all recognized each other as part of the same community. However, when the Enlightenment came along, that period in European history, and yes, the movements were born from the unique episode of European history that we call the Enlightenment, things changed because we had something known as emancipation. Now, in America, most of the time when we hear the word emancipation, we are thinking of the Emancipation Proclamation, which began the process of freeing the enslaved people of this country. However, when we talk about emancipation for Judaism, we are talking about an earlier phenomenon, earlier in the 1800s, where in Europe, Jews were being offered a deal. As Europe was moving into a nation-state period, as it was letting go of the old feudal structures and becoming more modern states and becoming more entranced with the idea of state building rather than king building, we were given a choice. And the choice was simple, that if we fit in, we will be welcome in these new European states. They weren't actually new, but they were being thought of in new ways. That to fit in, all we had to do was give up our hope for a return to Israel, our hope for a Messiah, our following of distinctive laws, and our sense of peoplehood. And we're going to look at why each of those was on the chopping board for those that were offering us this freedom. So what was wrong with our continued hope for a return to Israel, meaning the land of Israel, the establishment of a Jewish state? Well, in the eyes of those that were suspicious of our ability to integrate into Europe, they were wondering, why would we want there to be a Jewish state unless we are not loyal to this country? After all, if I am living in France or Germany, as it eventually would become known, or Italy or Poland or England, why would I be dreaming of another country being established somewhere else? What would it be? What would it be saying about my loyalty to the local state? Now, that question of Jewish loyalty to the local state has persisted until this very day. And you'll find when we discuss anti-Semitism in a later class that it is still a common element of Jew hatred, and something that we are constantly being accused of in a way that other religions or groups are not being. But it became very powerful during this time. Also, our attackers said, why are we hoping for Mashiach, for a Messiah? After all, we must not love this country, France, Germany, Italy, if we are hoping for salvation, given that the concept of salvation in Judaism is one of an end of suffering, something we'll talk about in a later class on our vision for the end of days. That implies that our current situation in our current country must not be ideal. Well, that sounds very ungrateful, say the people of the country, meaning those who consider themselves the dominant and rightful members of that country. That makes it very ungrateful that they are willing to tolerate our presence in their land. So we were being asked to give up our feeling that eventually the world would be made better through the coming of the Messiah. Distinctive laws? Well, as Europe was trying to decide what it meant to be a nation without relying only on the idea that you were under the authority of the same king, they realized that they needed to share much in their life in order to make that national identity stick. And that meant that they wanted us to fit in. If we were going to talk different, dress different, eat different, pray different, act different, then that would set us apart. And they were wrestling with creating a cohesion out of the different elements that had only been held together by the might of a king during this transition period. And so we were being asked to give up our distinctive laws. And last but not least, as you can probably now understand completely, they wanted us to give up our sense of peoplehood. Jewish people have, for thousands of years, felt a kinship and a connection to Jews no matter where they live in the world. That was not considered to be normal in the European world. If you lived in France, your loyalty was to France, period. Yes, the people of Germany or Italy might be of the same religion as you, but that didn't matter. They might be of similar ethnic background, but that didn't matter, except for a few border cases where people were fighting over territory. In general, you were supposed to be loyal to your country and to no one else. The fact that we had an affiliation and an affinity for Jewish people around the world was suspicious. And indeed, I find that Johann David Michaels summarizes this very well. And he was writing in 1782, really at the threshold of emancipation, as many of the enlightened European thinkers were trying to decide what to do with the Jew. And he wrote, "One must mention something which casts doubt on the full and steadfast loyalty of the Jews to the state and the possibility of their full integration." There's that question of loyalty. Namely, their messianic expectation of a return to Palestine. The Jews will always see the state as a temporary home, which they will leave in the hour of their greatest happiness to return to Palestine. For similar reasons, their forefathers were suspect in the eyes of the Egyptians. So notice, first of all, that Michaels is allying himself with the Egyptian state, which enslaved and murdered Jewish people out of a sense of fear that we might align ourselves with enemies. Again, reinforcing this notion of suspect of our loyalty. Although I do find it rather shocking that anybody familiar with the Bible would ever feel comfortable putting themselves on the same side as Pharaoh, since, as we know, the Bible is not exactly complimentary of Pharaoh. the Bible doesn't really support what Pharaoh did and Pharaoh's rejection of our right to be free. But we can see in this a wonderful example of the enlightened thinking of Europe, that the Jews were just on the edge of being not really suitable for full integration into the country. However, at that time, at the threshold of the Enlightenment, the early 1800s, a group of Jews decided that, you know what, maybe we can make this work. And that group of Jews became known as the Reform Movement, or Reform Judaism. Now, before I continue to describe the early Reform movement, I need to put in a very, very important disclaimer, which is to say that the Reform movement of 2021 is not a copy of the Reform movement of 1810. The Reform movement of 2021 has come a long way in many different discussions and internal interpretations of what Judaism is and should be. And they are about as far from this group in the early 1800s as I am. However, for historical purposes, we do need to understand the beginning of the Reform movement, as this movement sets in motion a cascade of events that will lead to the creation of both the Orthodox and conservative movements in due time. And yes, you did hear me right. The Orthodox movement is not older than the Reform movement, right? The Orthodox movement is the second oldest movement. The Reform movement is the oldest movement in Judaism. I'll cover that a little bit more when we look at Orthodoxy in just a second. But for the moment, just take a look at what they were talking about doing in the 1800s. And remember, this was in response to this perceived opportunity to integrate, to receive freedoms, and to be treated with more respect and just basic human dignity, which had been denied to Jews throughout Europe for, at this point, more than 1,000 years. So what do they say to do when they form their own Hamburg temple? They plan to arrange in the city also for themselves, as well as others who think as they do, a dignified and well-ordered ritual, according to which the worship service shall be conducted. Specifically, there shall be introduced at such services a German sermon, a choral singing to the accompaniment of an organ. All right, there is much to unpack from this small snippet from the full constitution of this first Reform temple in Germany. So first of all is the fact that they called themselves a temple. This was a bit surprising at the time for the Jewish world, because when we talked about the word the word temple, we were referring to the temple in Jerusalem, the Beit HaMikdash. However, because of the principles of giving up our hope for a return to Israel and giving up our messianic aspirations, the idea was that wherever we were, that was our temple, and we were no longer looking to Israel or Jerusalem. So the usage of the term temple was very, very symbolic at this point. Secondly, you'll see, as I underlined, that this is the first conscious attempt to say that we will be building a community center, a synagogue, a temple, that will be a place for only those who think as they do. Remember I said earlier, and I'll flip back just so that you can be reminded of that prior to this time, congregations were made up of many, many different types of people and with many different opinions. Sometimes this caused friction. Sometimes people just ignored people that were different, but they all essentially inhabited the same community identity and space. What the Reform movement is acknowledging or attempting to create is a like-minded set of people within the community, that there would be more unanimity within the community, unanimity of thought and practice. Also, they were trying to make it more German, dignified and well-ordered. At this point, one of the many critiques that many anti-Semites had against Judaism was that our services were chaotic, that there were children making noise, that there were people who would be doing their own prayers and they wouldn't be in perfect synchronization with everyone else, that there was often, just this cacophony of noise, as we engaged in our private prayers publicly as a group. They wanted to make this more like a Protestant or Catholic service, where there would be someone at the front and there would be lots of people sitting quietly, and they would respond when told to. So they wanted to model this on the behavior and the worship service of their Christian neighbors. Likewise, having a German sermon, or indeed a sermon at all, was also taken from the German neighbors' Christian behavior. Up to this point, rabbis did not provide sermons. Indeed, rabbis were not considered to be specifically a element of the synagogue, but were considered to be community figures. They would be at the synagogue, of course, and they would give important lectures and teaching at different times, but they would not give a weekly sermon the way the Christian pastors and priests did. The Reform movement wanted to change that. They also wanted to introduce choral singing, again, mimicking the Christian behavior, and to use an organ in order to provide more coordinated and beautiful and dignified singing. And many people considered this to be a perfectly acceptable set of changes that would not only allow them to be respected by the secular and Christian society, but would also allow them to respect themselves as members of that culture, as they had already absorbed these cultural values from the German community at large. Now, before we look at the response to this from what will become called the Orthodox world, I want to make sure that you understand that there was one other option that these early members of the Reform movement were not taking, and that was giving up their Judaism. There were Jews who gave up their Judaism, who converted to Christianity and simply left the Jewish community entirely. The Reform movement has never advocated that, has never thought that was an ideal result, and in fact believed that what they were doing would best ensure continued Jewish life and spirituality. They were not giving up everything just to fit in. They were perhaps prompted to do this because of that opportunity, but they wanted to still retain their Jewish identity and their Jewish practice with significant changes. And it's very important, as many people, especially those who attacked them, that will be called the Orthodox movement, it's very important that we understand that these were not people trying to ruin Judaism. These were not people trying to leave Judaism. These were people who were doing what they thought, and I disagree, but they thought would be in the best interest of the Jews of their community. So we must have respect for that, because they always had the option of simply converting to Christianity and walking away from Judaism, and they did not advocate or take that option for themselves. Any questions on the Reform movement before we look at Orthodoxy? Okay. So Orthodox Judaism, as I mentioned, was a response to the Reform movement. Prior to the Reform movement, there was no organized, systematic, or unified Orthodox ideology or ideas. Yes, there were people who practiced many of what we would now recognize as strict interpretations that lean towards what we call orthodoxy. However, as an organized and coherent movement, as an ideology, as a statement of principle, and as a cooperative movement, it simply didn't exist. But after the radical changes of Hamburg in particular, there was pushback, there was a reaction. By the way, those of you who know European history may recognize that what happened in Christianity with the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation is what is happening here as well. It's just happening a lot faster in the Jewish world than it took in the Christian Europe world. So the Rabbinical Court of Hamburg had their response to what was done in the Reform movement. And these are three of the different points they made. It is forbidden to change the worship that is customary in Israel from Birkot HaShachar, meaning from the early morning blessings, to Aleinu, meaning the end of the service, and all the more so to make any deletions in the traditional liturgy. It is forbidden to pray in any language other than the Holy Tongue, meaning Hebrew, Every prayer book that is printed improperly and not in accordance with our practice is invalid, and it is forbidden to pray from it. It is prohibited to play a musical instrument in the synagogue on the Sabbath and on the festivals, even when it is played by a non-Jew. Now, what's very important to understand is that all three of those points are absolutely against Jewish law. They are changes, but they are changes to forbid something that was permitted, but having been used by the Reform movement, the Orthodoxy is now making a prohibition against what had once been an acceptable option. Maybe not widespread, but accepted. And take, for example, point one, that it is forbidden to change anything in the worship. Well, the very fact that they mentioned Aleinu should have made them blush, because Aleinu itself is an addition. We have a very good and long discussion about exactly when Aleinu was written and when it was added to our service. And all the more so, Aleinu has not been included in every service by every Jewish group. It began in the Rosh Hashanah service and eventually became part of every service in the Ashkenazic world, but it did not become part of every service in the Sephardic world. So the fact that we already are aware of changes that have happened over our centuries should make us a little bit more hesitant to say it is forbidden to change anything. However, the prohibition that they are talking about here, or about languages, or even about instruments, are prohibitions not about Jewish law, but about cultural and societal change. They wanted to make sure that their association, that their institutions, that their community would remain intact. And they felt that the best response to this question of the modern world, of how best do we fit in, was to forbid anything that made us fitting in more easier. Now, they are absolutely changing things. They are a movement of change, just as much as the Reform movement is a movement of change. The fact that their changes are to institute prohibitions rather than to institute permissions doesn't change the fact that they are changing the facts, that they are changing things. But they are doing so, like their Reform counterparts, because they believe that these changes, these limitations and introduced and invented stringencies will best protect the community of Jewish people and best protect Judaism long term. So while, again, I, as a conservative rabbi, disagree with what they did, I do respect that they were doing it out of a position where they thought that the changes they were making would be the best changes for helping to strengthen and protect Judaism from the threat that they saw that the modern world posed. All right, questions or comments on this beginning of the Orthodox movement? All right. So there's one movement left among the major movements. There are many, many other smaller movements in the modern world from the 20th century onward. We're not going to have time to go into all of them. But the one that I do definitely want to make sure we talk about is the conservative movement, because that's me. I am a conservative Jew. Even though I was born and raised in the Reform movement, I became a conservative Jew in my late teens and have continued, obviously, to be a conservative Jew since then. And conservative Judaism began in the United States in 1886, more or less, depending upon exactly where you want to call its official start time. And the basic position of conservative Judaism is that Judaism has always been flexible. And so forbid, forbid, forbid was never our tendency. But we have also been true to the Torah. We do not simply throw out the Torah that we have received because it's convenient or enticing. As Frankel in this quote says, maintaining the integrity of Judaism simultaneously with progress. This is the essential problem of the present. Meaning, how do we do both? How do we continue to enjoy the benefits of progress in the modern world while also keeping the integrity of Judaism? Where is the point where the two apparent contraries can meet? The viewpoint of Orthodox is clear. Where else, save in the meticulous observance of the precepts, can it find that complete satisfaction? Essentially, he's saying the Orthodox wish to reject progress, the modern world, and only focus on their interpretation of meticulous observance. On the other hand, This party, and he's referring to the Reform movement, sees salvation in overcoming the past, in carrying progress to the limits, in rejecting religious forms and returning merely to the simple original idea. The Reform movement often would talk about, and still does talk about, capturing the essence of the truth of Torah rather than the particular points of the Torah, rather than its particular observances or commandments. And as such, the Reform movement is overcoming, in their view, the baggage of the past in order to be freer in the modern world. However, come on, there we go. The conservative movement has a different interpretation. We will now turn to a third party. That's the conservative movement, which has arisen from the first, acknowledging that essentially the conservative movement was born from orthodoxy, or rather from rabbis and people who were from the Orthodox world that were unsatisfied with what orthodoxy was doing and was appalled of the 1880s form of Reform Judaism. And this third party recognizes that the task of Judaism is religious action, but demands that this action shall not be empty of spirit and that it shall not become mechanical. So yes, we embrace and we support the idea of religious action, what you would call commandments, but we do believe that there needs to be a reinvigoration of the spirit of those commandments and that they should not be just mechanically performed. Furthermore, it holds that we must omit certain unimportant actions that are not inherently connected either with the high ideas or with the religious forms delineated by the revealed laws. Now, that's a very fancy way of an 1880s person talking, of basically saying that, yes, there are certain customs and traditions and practices which are perhaps outdated and unnecessary, or could at least be updated. And that is perfectly fine, but we will not get rid of anything that is part of revealed law, meaning the Torah. So you will find that you will encounter conservative Judaism, for example, in the modern contemporary world, where people will say it is fine to play an instrument on Shabbat, but you are not going to find a conservative rabbi who says it's fine to eat pork. That is simply far too anchored within the clear definition of the commandment of how we eat, and something that is not subject to adaptation. That is not a custom, that is not a tradition, that is not a community practice. That is law, that is halakha, that is a mitzvah. And as such, conservative Judaism will often be more willing to adjust the edges of our action, the customs and practices, but we remain steadfast on that centerpiece of law. Now, interpreting the law is something that will become important in just a minute when we talk about some of the practical differences in our day. But that is the basic framework that we are working with. Now, this third party then declares that Judaism must be saved for all time. Again, the conservative movement believes that the crisis of modernity does pose a threat, and we believe that the supreme flexibility, to be diplomatic, of the Reform movement of the 1880s and the supreme inflexibility of the Orthodox world are not the best solution for the long-term viability of Judaism. Instead, it affirms both the divine value and historical basis of Judaism, meaning the historical idea that there can be evolution and change, again, in certain areas, and therefore believes that by introducing some changes, it may achieve some agreement with the concepts and conditions of the time, that we don't have to pretend that we are still living in the 1500s. We don't have to pretend that we're still living in the 1800s. We should instead be living in our 21st century, but still according to Judaism, as Judaism would want us to be living in the 21st century. All right, so those are the sort of big ideas of each of the three primary movements, streams, sects of Judaism that are part of the modern world. I should point out, as you're considering whether to ask any questions, that the conservative movement, when it was founded in the 1880s, did not want to be a movement. The conservative movement began as an organization of synagogues that was trying to not be Orthodox and trying to not be Reform and trying to be what we would consider traditional Judaism, which means holding on to the essential core of Judaism while still allowing for the natural organic change over time that has always been an inherited characteristic of Judaism. However, over the last century, it became obvious that we needed more organization and could not simply be the in-between space, but we needed to be more proactive. There was a question in chat asking about the Reform movement today. So we're going to now pop into a couple of different comparisons between the three primary movements. And in these comparisons, I will be talking about the Reform movement, the conservative movement, and the Orthodox movement of the 21st century. So this will show you some of the updates that have happened within the Reform movement. And I will try to give more detail for each of these topics as we go. I do want to point out one more very important disclaimer that the Reform, conservative, and Orthodox worlds are very, very broad. There are many Jews that are officially part of the Reform movement that have a lifestyle and maybe even a philosophy that overlaps with parts of the conservative movement. And there are many Jews in the conservative movement that have a lifestyle and ideology that overlaps with Orthodoxy on many points. And vice versa, many conservative Jews might overlap with some Reform, and many Orthodox might overlap with some conservative. This overlap is perfectly natural. We are a people that have much room for discussion and debate, and none of the movements should ever be considered to be monolithic. Only the most narrow of certain groups within certain yeshivas or certain Hasidic groups, which demands absolute loyalty to a much finer degree, have complete unanimity. And even there, I will hopefully not shatter anyone's illusions. There is no way to ensure unanimity of thought. Each person is always master of their own conscience and able to believe in their heart what they wish to believe. So let's talk about the general tendencies within the different movements on different topics. So the first is revelation. That is to say, what is the Torah, right? The Torah is what? What do we make of this book, which has been at the heart of Judaism for 3,000 years? The Reform movement of the 21st century believes that the Torah is a record of the Jewish people's relationship with God. It has changed, meaning the text itself has changed over time, and not all of its words should be seen as eternally true. Some were only true for other generations, some were human interpretations, and thus limited. So the Reform movement believes that the Torah is the important cornerstone of Jewish thought, but it is the beginning, not the end of Jewish thought. And it is something that has been consciously and deliberately edited by humans, and thus not every word or phrase needs to be treated with a level of divine reverence. The conservative movement disagrees. We believe that the Torah that we have is the Torah that God wants us to have. And yes, there are some people who will debate exactly how the Torah went from God to parchment, but the conservative movement, you will find unanimity that the Torah is what God wants us to have. Every word, thus, is divinely true and eternal. Our ability to understand it is still growing, but nothing in the Torah can be ignored or erased. Now, when I said earlier on that interpretation was still a very important part, as we talked about in our earlier class on the oral and written Torah, the conservative movement believes very strongly that traditional Judaism has always recognized that there needs to be a very important activity called human understanding, deliberation, and discussion in order to make sure that the Torah is being interpreted well and properly. This is something that can upset some people, especially those coming from some other religious traditions, because it does mean that we recognize that interpretation is more flexible than the actual text itself. That is not something that should alarm us. That is something that instead should inspire us. You will know if you learn Jewish history and study that the range of interpretation has been relatively stable throughout our history. Indeed, that was part of what we were fighting against the Karaite insurgency. But we still do recognize that among the Ashkenazic, Sephardic, and other communities of the Jewish world, there is often room for interpretation of different communities. Even within the Ashkenazic or within the Sephardic world, there is often variety of interpretation. That is perfectly fine. It is enshrined within the Mishnah, Midrash, and Talmud, our earliest rabbinic books, and something that should not make us afraid. However, I do recognize that in the Orthodox world, as they instituted their changes to try and isolate and protect the Jewish world from any outside pressures, that sounds wrong now. But if we roll back the clock to 500 years ago, even the most traditional rabbis would agree with what I just said. But the Orthodox world, well, the Orthodox world views the Torah as follows. The Torah we have was given in a literal series of dictations between God and Moses. Its interpretation is fixed and unchanging for all time. Now, I'll point out that that does not actually match Jewish historical records, nor does that match actual Orthodox practice, which does interpret and change things over time. After all, the Hamburg Rabbinic Court, which was what we would call Orthodox now, changed the idea of not being able to pray in other languages or not being able to change the Siddur. So this is their belief, but it doesn't always match the practice. Israel, meaning the land of Israel and the idea of Israel in Jewish thought. What does it mean to you? In the Reform movement, we have the classical idea that I began with, which was that the land of Israel is part of our history, but not our future. We are citizens of other countries. I am French, British, or German, and we have no desire to return or rebuild. The Reform movement of today, however, has done a complete 180 on this. Israel is the homeland of our people, and we should support it. Now, they choose different ways to support it, depending upon their own idea of what would be best, but the Reform movement does officially support the modern state of Israel. I should point out, however, that it was the conservative movement that supported the founding and independence of Israel first. Neither the Reform movement nor the Orthodox movements in the early 20th century supported Israel as an actual political idea. We did. Instead, because we believe we long for the liberation of Israel and support all those who rebuild it. One day it will be the center of a global redemption, and we will never turn our back on Israel. The conservative movement has consistently been the strongest ally and supporter of Israel among the different official movements of Judaism. And we have always believed that those who rebuild it deserve our respect and support. The Orthodox world? Well, it's complicated. Many rabbis, like I mentioned, reject the modern state of Israel because it wasn't founded by the Messiah, by Mashiach. However, since it exists, many also say that we should do what we can to make it conform to the Orthodox vision of Judaism. So Orthodoxy has kind of a complicated relationship with the state of Israel. The idea of Israel as being our eternal homeland, they absolutely agree with. The concept of the modern state of Israel is something that continues to be a little flexible depending upon which Orthodox group you are talking to. However, by and large, most Orthodox do support the modern state of Israel in their own way, but they also wish to impose Orthodox interpretation and practice as being the rules of the modern state of Israel. If anybody here is interested in moving to Israel at some point and wonders what that means in practice, we can talk about that later. The Messiah, Meshiach, who's that, right? What do we mean when we talk about the Messiah? Well, in the Reform movement of today, they would say that they do not wait for a person to redeem the world. They are not looking for an actual personal Messiah, the Messiah in the shape of a human being. They instead believe God has already taught us what we need. The visions of the prophets, in particular, which are about the Messianic age, when the Spirit of God will unite the world, is about the Spirit of God that will unite the world, not about an individual. So the idea of a redeemer, the idea of a savior, the whole concept of a Mashiach as being a descendant of King David, they consider all of that to be purely metaphorical. They still believe that there will be redemption. They still believe there will be an end of human suffering, but most Reform thinkers do not consider that to be something that will come through a biological agent, a human being, but instead will come through human action spread through all humans as we come closer and closer to the vision of redemption. The conservative movement does have some people who believe that as well. However, by and large, we believe and we look for a Messiah who will inspire us and the rest of the world as well to draw closer to God and thus in human suffering. So we believe that there will be a human being. It will be human and mortal, and will be a teacher that will be recognized universally as somebody who is drawing the world closer to God, and that will that will result in the end of human suffering. Now, that's something we're going to go into much more detail when we look into our end of days class, but that is the most common position in the conservative movement. The Orthodox world reads the prophecies a little bit even more literally, holding very tightly to the concept that the Messiah will come from the house of David and will bring redemption to the Jewish people through kingship and teaching. There are conservative Jews as well who also emphasize the idea of the Messiah eventually being king. However, there are other conservative Jews who believe that the idea of the Messiah's kingship is less an idea of somebody with a crown and a throne, and more the idea of a person being elected as a ruler overall by universal acclaim, because we recognize the person's unique quality to lead and teach. And when we talk about change, well, this is where you begin to see some of the biggest differences of the concept of change itself. In the Reform movement, the way Judaism has been practiced became stale and mechanical. Change helped revive the spirit and move us closer to God, and thus it is a good thing. Change is considered a positive virtue by itself. Innovation is something that should be embraced and created, and not something that should be feared within the Reform ideology. In the conservative view, change is not good and change is not bad, meaning by itself, we cannot give a value, and we don't seek change and we don't run from change. Judaism has always been adapted to new cultures and situations. Change is not a goal to be pursued. We don't wake up today saying, what can I change? But change also isn't something to be avoided. It should be organic and it should be well studied. And more on that idea of how we decide when to change on the next slide. But the conservative movement is not afraid of change, nor do we worship change. We recognize it as being within its proper realm, an important part of Judaism, but not something that should be valued one way or the other by itself. The Orthodox world, as I mentioned, is very adamant about protecting itself from the change of the modern world, even though it does hopefully acknowledge that Judaism has changed in antiquity. And it believes that the way Judaism has been practiced must be protected at all costs, even if that means being stricter than our ancestors. Protective change is okay, and they have their own interpretation of what counts, but all other types of change are bad. So the Orthodox world sees change under a lens of suspicion, unless those changes are changes designed to make us more removed, more protected from the threat of the modern world. Now, like I said, we can have a much longer conversation sometime about exactly what threat the modern world poses and whether or not the Orthodoxy has overreacted to that threat, but that is their ideology at the moment. And finally, the concept of authority. Who makes the rules? Well, in the Reform movement, in keeping with the idea of the Enlightenment and the idea of the modern world, the individual is the sole authority for knowing what God wants him or her to do. The community and rabbi can instruct, but cannot dictate. This is why in the Reform movement, if an individual says, I don't think that keeping Shabbat is an important spiritual or ethical idea, and they decide to stop keeping Shabbat, go shopping, have a barbecue, whatever they wish to do, they, as an individual, give themselves permission to do that. They do not need to be in keeping with or worried about the ideas of their community or of their rabbinic leadership. The individual is the sole arbiter for those types of things. Now, the Reform movement does acknowledge that things like murder and theft are still universally applicable. However, there's often a bit of a gray border on some of those types of mitzvot of what counts as being personal and what counts as being communal. But that's, again, a much longer investigation into the details. The conservative movement, on the other hand, says that no, the individual does not get to make these decisions of primary type, these primary types of decisions. Only those trained in Jewish law can make decisions that are binding for a community. We call those people rabbis. Individuals must study to know how those decisions and to know how to apply them for themselves. Now, that means that if you are an average person and you are trying to decide if you want to buy swordfish or not, you don't get to decide if swordfish is kosher or not, but you do get to make yourself aware of the different opinions on the concept. It's kosher, by the way, and to be able to then make that decision when you're at the market buying your lovely swordfish. So there is room for individual application based upon learning and understanding. There is, as I already mentioned, room for diversity within different communities because communities can choose their own rabbi, meaning that I am technically employed by the congregation of Temple Israel. And if the congregation as a whole was unhappy with my interpretation and application of Jewish law, I could be removed, I could be fired. And likewise, if I was unhappy with our congregation and its willingness to listen to and follow my interpretations and application of Jewish law, I could quit and find a different community. That form of soft democracy, if you will, that a person is able to make binding decisions, but only as long as they are allowed to have that authority, has been a characteristic of Judaism for at least 2,000 years. Communities cannot be forced to accept a rabbi, and a rabbi cannot be forced to accept a community. It has to be a mutual understanding. The Orthodox world has its own interpretation on this. Local rabbis can answer routine questions. You know, Rabbi, can I light fire on Shabbat? No. Rabbi, can I steal from my employees? No. But real decisions can only be made by what are called Gedolei Hador, the greats of the generation. If there is a new concept, a new idea, a new question, a new challenge, the local community rabbi does not get to weigh in on that. Instead, the heads of the yeshivot, the universities, the heads of the different organizations within the Orthodox world, they will make those decisions, and then they will give their interpretations. And thus, only really, they are the only ones who really have authority within the Orthodox world. The conservative movement does have a Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that you can check out rabbinical.assembly.org and find out more about Jewish law through them and read some of the opinion pieces of what we call tshuvot that they've published. But you will notice on all of those tshuvot that there is a special line which says the local rabbi is the final arbiter for any application of Jewish law in that community. So if they make a decision that I disagree with, I am allowed under the conservative movement to say, I don't agree with that, and that's not what we're doing here. And likewise, if I make a decision they don't agree with, they cannot come in and kick me out. There are a few laws and practices, mostly involving, for example, not marrying somebody who's not Jewish to somebody that is Jewish, making sure that we always have a get, a proper divorce document before allowing someone to remarry, and things like that. But by and large, we are left to make the decisions on our own, as was the case for 2,000 plus years, where rabbis would serve their community and would not constantly be sending requests for more information up the chain of command. All right, so that was the race for this evening through the different movements. I will remind you, as I've reminded everybody who wants to convert, who's talked to me before, if you are not quite so comfortable with the concepts of the conservative movement and would rather talk to an Orthodox rabbi or a Reform rabbi, that is okay with me. I am not going to be upset. I am not going to be offended. And I will do my best to help you find somebody that might be more suitable or agreeable, or just maybe answer a few more questions from their point of view. I am what is called a pluralist, in the idea that although I do believe that the conservative movement best and most accurately reflects both traditional Judaism and our best hope for a strong Jewish future, I am not so arrogant as to believe that the Reform and Orthodox movements have nothing to offer. I cannot say that because I am not arrogant. And I certainly understand that for different people at different times, the other movements may be the best place for them to be. So if you need help with that, let me know. If you're happy to continue studying with me, that's okay. But it's important to find your right place based upon your understanding and your comfort within a community. So let me know if you need any more information on that. But with that, we are going to be finishing for tonight because I have a meeting in 3 minutes that I need to go get ready for. So thank you all very much. Please continue to study, and I will see you in 2 weeks, because next week it's Thanksgiving. And at least in the conservative movement, we do celebrate Thanksgiving. So please make sure that you have a nice time, hopefully with family, if that is something you can safely do. But at the very least, with a little bit of extra gratitude and thankfulness for everything that we enjoy right now. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, Rabbi.